At 00:15 hours on June 6, 1944, Captain Frank Lillyman stood in the door of a C-47 transport aircraft at 500 feet above the Normandy coast, watching tracer fire arc up through the darkness below. Lillyman was 29 years old, commanding officer of the 101st Pathfinder Company, Provisional, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. Tonight he was leading Pathfinder Team 1, a group of 18 men, whose job was to jump into occupied France 30 minutes before the main airborne assault and mark drop zone. A, with lights and radar beacons, so that 6,600 paratroopers following behind them could find their landing zones in the darkness. The aircraft shuddered as German anti-aircraft fire bracketed the formation. Lillyman could see muzzle flashes from the ground, white and orange bursts against the black landscape. The pilot was flying too fast, over 150 miles per hour instead of the planned 110. The aircraft was too high, at 700 feet, instead of the planned 500. And they were off course, though Lillyman wouldn't know how far off course until he was on the ground. Lillyman's equipment weighed over 100 pounds. Standard T5 parachute, reserve chute, M1 Garand rifle strapped to his leg, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tool, first aid kit, rations, and most importantly, the equipment that made Pathfinders different from every other paratrooper jumping that night. Strapped to his leg in a padded canvas case was a holophane light, a battery-powered signal lamp that could be seen for miles. In his equipment bag was a Eureka radar transponder, a 35-pound electronic device that would guide aircraft to the drop zone even in complete darkness or heavy clouds. The Pathfinder concept was relatively new to American airborne operations. The British had pioneered the technique during operations in North Africa and Sicily, using small teams equipped with lights and radar beacons to mark landing zones ahead of the main force. The Americans had adopted the concept in late 1943, establishing a Pathfinder school at North Witham in England. The training was brutal. Jump training, night navigation, equipment operation, small unit tactics, survival behind enemy lines. Of the 300 men who volunteered for Pathfinder training, fewer than 200 completed the course. The equipment they carried was sophisticated by 1944 standards but crude by any modern measure. The Eureka transponder was essentially a radio beacon that responded to signals from Rebecca radar sets installed in aircraft. When a C-47 with Rebecca equipment approached the drop zone, the Eureka would send back a signal that appeared on the aircraft's radar scope, giving the pilot a precise bearing to the drop zone. In theory, this system could guide aircraft through complete darkness, thick clouds, or heavy fog. In practice, it had never been tested under combat conditions. The holophane lights were simpler but equally important. Each Pathfinder team carried multiple lights that could be arranged in patterns to mark drop zone boundaries and indicate wind direction. The lights used colored filters: green for the approach end, amber for the edges, red for the far end. From altitude, the pattern looked like an illuminated letter T, with the crossbar indicating the upwind end of the drop zone. Pilots could see the lights from several miles away, if conditions were clear. But conditions over Normandy on the night of June 5th to 6th were anything but clear. Low clouds obscured much of the coastline. German anti-aircraft fire was heavier than expected. Many transport pilots, inexperienced in combat flying, took evasive action that scattered their formations and threw off their navigation. The Pathfinder teams, jumping first and alone into hostile territory, would face the worst of these problems. Lillyman's team had trained together for 4 months. They knew each other's capabilities, trusted each other's competence. Private First Class Robert Murphy carried the Eureka beacon. Corporal Frank Brumbaugh carried backup holophane lights. Each man had specific responsibilities. They had rehearsed the procedure dozens of times in England. Jump, assemble, deploy equipment, mark the drop zone, wait for the main force. 30 minutes from jump to equipment activation. That was the plan. The green light came on at 00:16 hours. Lillyman jumped. The static line snapped his parachute open with the familiar violent jerk. He had time for maybe 6 oscillations before hitting the ground. At 700 feet and 150 miles per hour forward speed, the descent time was less than 20 seconds. German machine guns opened fire from multiple directions, tracers cutting through the darkness. Lillyman heard the distinctive sound of German MG-42 machine guns firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound American troops called Hitler's zipper because of its incredibly high rate of fire. He hit the ground hard in a hedgerow, the thick Norman bocage that would make infantry combat so brutal over the coming weeks. His chute caught in the trees. He was hanging 3 feet off the ground, completely exposed. He could hear German voices nearby, maybe 50 yards away. He cut his harness with his jump knife and dropped to the ground, pulling his rifle free from its case. Around him in the darkness, he could hear other Pathfinders landing, the rustle of parachutes in trees, equipment hitting the ground, men calling the cricket recognition signal, 1 click answered by 2 clicks. Lillyman checked his watch. 0018 hours. They had roughly 28 minutes before the first wave of the main airborne assault would arrive. 28 minutes to find the drop zone, set up the equipment, and activate the beacons. But he had no idea where they were. The drop had been scattered. He could account for only 6 men from his team of 18. The others were somewhere in the darkness, possibly miles away. The hedgerows made navigation almost impossible. Normandy's bocage country consisted of small fields surrounded by thick earthen banks topped with dense brush and trees. Each field was a small fortress, limiting visibility to a few dozen yards. Roads twisted between the hedgerows with no clear pattern. In daylight with a map, navigation was difficult. At night, under fire, with only a compass and dead reckoning, it was nearly impossible. But Pathfinders had one advantage. They had studied aerial photographs and maps for weeks. They had memorized terrain features, road patterns, building locations. Lillyman knew that Drop Zone A was supposed to be a large open field near the village of Highsville, roughly 2 miles inland from Utah Beach. He knew the field was bordered by a road on one side and a small stream on another. He knew there was a church steeple visible from the Drop Zone. He had to find these landmarks in complete darkness while avoiding German patrols. He gathered his 6 men and moved toward what he hoped was the drop zone. The group included Corporal Brumbaugh with the backup lights and Private Murphy with the precious Eureka beacon. 4 other Pathfinders whose names Lillyman never recorded in his after-action report. They moved through the hedgerows using tactics they had learned in training. 1 man forward to scout, the others following at intervals, watching for German patrols, listening for the sound of aircraft engines that would signal the approaching main force. At 0025 hours, they found a large open field that might have been Drop Zone A, or it might have been one of dozens of similar fields in the area. Lillyman couldn't be certain. There was no church steeple visible, but darkness and the hedgerows limited visibility. The stream that was supposed to border the drop zone was not where the map indicated it should be. But time was running out. In 15 minutes, 6,600 paratroopers would start jumping whether the Pathfinders were ready or not. Lillyman made the decision. They would set up here. Murphy began assembling the Eureka beacon. The device consisted of a receiver unit, a transmitter unit, a battery pack, and an antenna that had to be deployed away from the beacon to avoid interference. Murphy worked in complete darkness, assembling components by feel, connecting cables, checking connections. The Eureka was temperamental. Moisture could short out the circuits. A loose connection could render it useless. The antenna had to be oriented correctly, or the signal would be too weak to detect. At 0032 hours, Murphy activated the beacon. A small indicator light glowed red, showing the unit was receiving power. Whether it was actually transmitting a usable signal was impossible to know until aircraft started arriving. Brumbaugh deployed the holophane lights in the pattern they had rehearsed, forming the T-shape that would mark the drop zone boundaries. Green light at the approach end, amber lights along the sides, red light at the far end. The lights were dim, designed to be visible from altitude, but not so bright that they would attract German attention from ground level. At 0040 hours, they heard aircraft engines, the deep rumble of hundreds of C-47 transports flying in formation, approaching from the northwest. The main assault was coming. Lillyman's Pathfinder team had completed their mission. The beacon was transmitting. The lights were deployed. Now they had to hope that the pilots could find the drop zone through the darkness, clouds, and anti-aircraft fire. What happened next would demonstrate both the brilliance and the fatal flaws of the Pathfinder concept. Some aircraft homed in on Lillyman's beacon and dropped their paratroopers directly on the marked field. These units, assembled quickly, moved to their objectives and completed their missions with relatively light casualties. But many other aircraft never detected the Eureka signal. Their Rebecca radar sets malfunctioned or were overwhelmed by electronic interference. These aircraft dropped their paratroopers based on dead reckoning navigation, which was wildly inaccurate given the evasive maneuvers and high speeds necessitated by German fire. The result was chaos. Paratroopers landed scattered across a 25-mile area. Some units landed miles from their objectives. Entire sticks of paratroopers dropped into flooded areas behind German coastal defenses and drowned, weighed down by their equipment. Individual paratroopers wandered through the Norman countryside for hours or days trying to find their units. But some units, particularly those that landed near Lillyman's beacon on Drop Zone A, assembled quickly and achieved their objectives. The other Pathfinder teams experienced similar problems. The team assigned to Drop Zone C near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont landed 4 miles off target. They set up their equipment anyway, hoping it would help at least some aircraft find the general area. The team assigned to Drop Zone D near Angoville-au-Plain was scattered so badly they never assembled as a complete unit. Individual Pathfinders set up whatever equipment they had, working alone in the darkness, trying to mark something that might help the main force. The 82nd Airborne Division's Pathfinder teams faced even worse conditions. Their drop zones were further inland, in areas more heavily defended by German forces. The Pathfinder team assigned to Drop Zone N, near Sainte-Mère-Église, was shot at from the moment they exited their aircraft. Several men were hit before they reached the ground. The survivors landed scattered across several square miles. They managed to set up one Eureka beacon, but it malfunctioned within minutes. The backup beacon was lost when the Pathfinder carrying it landed in a tree and was shot by German soldiers before he could cut himself down. Drop Zone T, west of the Murderette River, became a particular disaster. The area had been flooded by the Germans as a defensive measure, creating a shallow lake several miles across. Pathfinders landed in water that was sometimes knee-deep, sometimes over their heads. Heavy equipment dragged men underwater. The Eureka beacons were soaked and useless. Holophane lights sank. The Pathfinders who survived spent the night trying not to drown, rather than marking drop zones. When the main force arrived, they jumped into the same flooded area. Dozens of men drowned in the darkness, their equipment pulling them under before they could inflate their life vests. But despite these catastrophic failures, the Pathfinder mission succeeded in its fundamental purpose. Enough beacons functioned to guide enough aircraft to roughly the correct areas that the airborne assault achieved its objectives. The 101st Airborne secured the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach. The 82nd Airborne captured Sainte-Mère-Église, the first French town liberated on D-Day. These missions were accomplished by small groups of paratroopers who assembled in the darkness, often miles from their intended drop zones, and fought toward their objectives anyway. Captain Lillyman's Pathfinder team remained on Drop Zone A through the early morning hours, providing security for the assembly area as more and more paratroopers arrived. By 0300 hours, several hundred men had gathered near the beacon. Units began moving toward their objectives. Lillyman's team packed up their equipment and moved with the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment toward its objective, securing the northern approaches to the causeways. The Pathfinder mission had taken a terrible toll. Of the approximately 200 Pathfinders who jumped into Normandy ahead of the main force, over 40 were killed, wounded, or captured within the first hour. Many of the Eureka beacons malfunctioned or were destroyed. Most of the holophane lights were never properly deployed, but enough of the equipment worked well enough to make a difference. Post-action analysis by the Army Air Forces concluded that units dropping near functioning Pathfinder beacons had casualty rates 30% lower than units dropping without Pathfinder guidance. The equipment itself was remarkably advanced for 1944. The Eureka-Rebecca system represented the cutting edge of radar technology. The Eureka beacon operated on 214 MHz with a range of approximately 40 miles under ideal conditions. The Rebecca receiver in the aircraft could detect the Eureka's signal and display the bearing on a cathode ray tube scope. The pilot could then steer directly toward the beacon. The system worked brilliantly in testing. In combat, with multiple beacons operating simultaneously, with German electronic jamming, with damaged equipment and operators working under fire, it was far less reliable. The holophane lights were simpler but had their own problems. The batteries lasted only about 2 hours. The colored filters were fragile and often broke during the parachute landing. The lights themselves were dim enough to avoid attracting German attention from ground level. But that same dimness made them difficult to see from altitude if there was any smoke or haze. Pilots reported that they could see the lights clearly under ideal conditions, but lost sight of them if there was any anti-aircraft fire creating smoke, or if low clouds obscured the ground. After D-Day, the Pathfinder concept was refined and expanded. Later airborne operations in the Netherlands, Germany, and the Pacific used improved equipment and better-trained Pathfinder teams. The radar beacons became more reliable, the lights became brighter and more durable. Pathfinder training emphasized small unit tactics and survival behind enemy lines, recognizing that Pathfinder teams would often be scattered and forced to operate independently. Captain Frank Lillyman survived D-Day and continued serving with the 101st Airborne through the Normandy campaign. He participated in Operation Market Garden in September 1944, again serving as a Pathfinder. He was wounded during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, but recovered and returned to duty. He survived the war and returned to the United States, where he rarely spoke about his experiences. When asked about jumping first into Normandy, he would say that someone had to go first, and Pathfinders volunteered for it. Nothing special, just their job. The broader impact of the Pathfinder mission extended beyond D-Day. The concept of small, specialized teams jumping ahead of the main force to mark landing zones became standard practice in airborne operations. Modern military forces still use Pathfinder units, though the equipment has changed dramatically. GPS navigation, laser designators, and satellite communications have replaced Eureka beacons and holophane lights. But the basic concept remains the same. Small teams insert ahead of the main force, mark objectives, provide guidance, and accept extraordinary risk to increase the success of the larger operation. The men who jumped into Normandy 30 minutes before D-Day began knew they were accepting a mission with minimal chance of survival. They jumped alone into darkness and enemy fire. They carried equipment that had never been tested in combat. They had no backup, no reinforcements, no extraction plan. If they were killed or captured before completing their mission, the main force would still come. The assault would happen whether the Pathfinders succeeded or not. Their deaths would be noted in casualty lists and forgotten in the larger story of D-Day. But they jumped anyway. 18 men per team, 12 teams total, 216 men who went first so that 13,000 others would have a better chance of survival. That's what Pathfinders did. They marked the way through darkness so others could follow. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps more people discover these important pieces of history. Subscribe to stay connected with stories of the aircraft and crews that shaped the Second World War, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering those who served.